Hello. Obviously you'll have seen from the title that this video is about starting G-code in your slicer. And when I thought about I didn't think, somebody specifically asked me to some questions about starting and ending G-code, and kind of wanted to see what I used. I explained to them that really that's, starting and ending G-code is very printer and person specific, but that I would sort of go through what I think is the minimum, let's say, and what I use just in case it proves useful. I thought that video would take about 5 minutes, and what I didn't really think about was that I needed to, if you're going to discuss starting and ending G-code, you need to discuss at least a little bit G-code itself, and probably also cover a little bit where you might do these things in various slicers. What all that means is that it took a lot longer than I had expected, so rather than getting this done in one video, it's going to be stretched out over 2 videos. In this video we're going to be looking at the starting G-code part of it, and also a very, very brief overview of some G-code, M-code type commands, and where you set these things up in a few different slicers. So let's get stuck into that. So then, first things first, I'm not really going to explain what starting and ending G-code is, because if you didn't know, then you probably wouldn't be watching this video. Let's just say it is some instructions or operations you want your printer to carry out before it starts printing the actual part itself, and right at the end, just after it's finished printing your part. The kind of clues are in the name, really. Now, each slicer kind of deals with starting and ending G-code slightly differently, which is a bit of a pain. I will go through a few. So we've got slicer here, and you're going to find your starting and ending G-code under the printer settings tab and in the custom G-code section. And there you can see we've got an area to put our start G-code and an area to put our end G-code. There's also some other points in during the print where you can have some specific G-code, but we're not going to be looking at that. We're just going to be focusing on start G-code and end G-code. As the default sort of profiles in Slicer or Slic3r come, I believe there's a few instructions in here, and when you mouse over it gives you a little bit more information, which is actually fairly important. Basically, if you leave these blank, or rather if you don't include any hot end or heated bed temperature settings in your starting G-code, Slic3r will add them for you before the start G-code happens. So that's worth bearing in mind. It looks at anything you put in your start G-code, and if you do put in a setting to set the hot end or the heated bed temperature, then it basically removes its own settings from before the start G-code. So yeah, it's worth bearing in mind. Now, when in a minute we'll get to actually looking at the best way of starting out, I always think it's a good idea to just create something with no start G-code whatsoever, and then have a look to see what's going on before you do that, and exactly where it's inserted in the G-code, what instructions are carried out before, what instructions are carried out afterwards, and then that'll give you a good idea about what you should put in your G-code. So yeah, that is worth bearing in mind when you're doing that, because actually the operations that are carried out before your start G-code in Slic3r will be different depending on what you actually put in your start G-code. So that's Slic3r covered. Let's have a look at what should we look at next? Cura. So here is Cura, and Cura deals with it sort of pretty much in the same way, except the print settings, or the printer settings in Cura aren't really in the main sort of setting area over here on the right hand side. You will need to go into your settings menu and down to printer, and then assuming that you've already got your printer set up, go into manage printers. The one active is called Prushish in my case, and then you can click this button here, machine settings, and you will see there are some boxes down at the bottom here where you've got your start G code and your end G code. Now Cura has some defaults in here as well, so it's doing a simple homing. It's then moving the Z axis. It is then resetting the extruder 0 point. That's what G92 does. It then does a small extrusion, and then it resets the extruder point 0 point again. So that's all it's doing at the start, and at the end it's basically turning off any heat and retracting the filament. So you should bear that in mind. There's probably nothing in there, you know, that you absolutely have to have in there. All of this stuff really is, let's say, to taste, which is why it's quite difficult to do a video about it. It's really specific to A, how you have your printer set up, and B, what you like to happen at the start and at the end. So anyway, that's where it is in Cura. So we'll close that out. Let's have a look at Simplify3D. And Simplify3D does things probably in the best way for me, at least. And I guess it makes logical sense that start G code and end G code in both Slicer, Slic3r, and Cura is assigned to the printer settings. And printer settings are really something that you should set once for your printer and then probably never change. However, and that does kind of make some logical sense for start G code and end G code. However, I have reasons where I want to change between, you know, I want to change my start G code and end G code quite often. And having them baked into the printer settings is a little bit awkward. So I do prefer the way that Simplify3D does it. Go into edit process settings, and surprisingly it's under scripts rather than a G code, and you can see that we have a tab for the starting script, which is the starting G code, and a tab for the ending script or G code. I can't quite remember. I got a feeling that possibly by default both of these are blank. Anyway, the rest of this we are going to do in Simplify3D, as essentially it's the same thing. There are some differences on some of the variables or placeholders, such as setting the first layer temperature that you've already configured somewhere here. There are some, you know, special placeholders or variables you can insert in your G code to grab that temperature setting. They vary from slicer to slicer. But I will do a little sort of sheet of the main ones you're going to use and have it available on my website, which is linked in the description below. So anyway, let's start having a look at some of the things that, and we'll start with the starting script because why not? We'll have a look at some of the things that you should put in here, and maybe then look at some of the things that I've got in here and sort of why I do that. And yeah, so let's take a look at that. Okay, so like I said a minute ago, I think the best way to start is to see what is already in the G code file from your slicer without any of your own sort of special custom starting or ending G code. To see exactly where the G code is going to be inserted, I'll just put a couple of comments in here that we will adapt later. In fact, I'll put a blank line in there, and let's put in, we will add our stuff in here in a minute. We're just going to see whereabouts this pops up in the G code, and yeah, see what's before it and what's after it. Bear in mind that as you add in some of your own custom G code here, stuff around it that's being inserted by your slicer may adapt itself according to what you put in here. So you need to sort of keep an eye on what's going on as you build up your starting or ending G code. So these are comments. Basically anything in G code that starts with a semicolon is a comment all the way up to the end of the line. It's inserted in the G code file, but it's effectively ignored by any machines reading the G code. So it's just somewhere you can put notes. So in this case, we're just going to put this block in here, and we will export the G code. So let's do it like this and do it like that, and then let's open up the G code. And now, well, we've got all this gump at the top, and as you can see, all of these lines start with a semicolon, which basically means they are just notes. So we can skip over all these. These are all being inserted by the slicer, Simplify3D in this case. So we can scroll down and go through, ignoring basically all of this which has been inserted by the slicer, and try and find our stuff. Now the first time we come across it is here, starting G-code start. This is exactly what we inserted, but you'll see this whole line is actually just a comment. This is just part of the data that's stored, the comment data that's stored in the G-code file. It starts with a semicolon, therefore it's not actually G-code. So that's just, well, I don't really know why it's there, to be honest. It's just that Simplify3D inserts all of the settings, including your starting G-code and ending G-code, right at the beginning of the file. So we can effectively ignore that, and we need to go down and find the actual real one. And here it is. So this is our starting G-code. This is where we would have our G-code inserted, and this is where it ends. So what we want to do is we want to have a look to see what actual G-code, and the actual G-code obviously doesn't have a semicolon in front of it. So it's this. This is the G-code that's being inserted before our starting G-code, and this is the G-code that's being inserted after our starting G-code. So you can see that basically it does some setup before our starting G-code even. So G90 is setting the X, Y and Z axis to absolute positioning. So for example, if we go down here and we can see that we've got a G1, which is a movement, and it says Z to 0.2, and in an absolute, which is what G90 sets, it means it always goes to 0.2 mil away from the zero, the G-code 0 place position. If it was a relative, that would mean moving from where it is now by 0.2 millimeters. So that obviously, you know, doesn't really make sense for 3D printing applications. So usually the X, Y and Z axis are set to absolute positioning. So that's why the G90 is there. That doesn't really make much sense for the extruder though, because we don't really want to move the extruder in an absolute fashion. We generally want to move it in a relative fashion, like wherever it is now, you know, push through another couple of mil, or, you know, retract a couple of mil. So it's just relative to where it is currently. And the M83 sets that up so that the extruder is operating in relative mode. We then have a M106 command, which is setting the fan speed to 0 in this case, as we wanted our first layers at, well, with the fan off basically, so it's setting it to 0. It's then setting the heated bed temperature and the hot end temperatures, and we'll get to, you know, what these are in a minute. So it's kind of doing some stuff before our starting G-code. Now, we probably want to override some of that really. I may not want, in fact I definitely don't want my hot end to be set before my starting G-code. Now in Slic3r it tells you that if you insert some temperature sets in here, some G-code to set the hot end or the heated bed temperature, then it removes that from its own G-code. And the same is true, or it doesn't tell you, the same is true in Simplify3D. So now that we know what's going on before and, you know, somewhat less importantly, after our G-code, our sort of custom G-code, we can start to insert our own G-code. And in order to do that, we need to decide what we want it to do. In my case, at the start, the only thing that I really need it to do is to prime the sort of filament through the nozzle. The reason being is at the end of every print, I retract the filament right out of the hot end and out of the extruder. So when it comes to you know, starting a new print, I've just put the filament back in, and I want to make sure that you know, there's a good continuous run of filament coming out, so that it doesn't sort of, you know, start printing and then, you know, splatter, run out of filament slightly whilst it's still priming. So the way that I do that, and this is where it all comes down to your machine and your personal taste, is that I have an area of my printer which at the moment is dead space. I can't really print in it due to some physical blockages, but I can do some priming lines, and so that's the only thing really that I want my starting G-code to do, is to prime the nozzle in an area sort of outside my normal print area. The other thing that I definitely want it to do, and obviously your mileage may vary, but if you've got, you know, automated bed level compensation or bed leveling or whatever you want to call it, you probably want that to happen as well before the print starts. And as you can see, there is no command here to do that. It's literally moving straight into the print, yeah, that's that. It's also not even homing at all, so yeah, not much is going to really get going here. So those are the sort of things that we need to be looking out for. I'd say the absolute minimum you want is to make sure that obviously your machine is homing before it starts doing its stuff. And if you've got bed level compensation capabilities, then you also want to activate them. That really is probably all you absolutely need, and that's even if you've got bed level compensation. So I'm going to deal with those, and the additional thing I want is the priming, and that is entirely what is in my starting G-code as it stands. Okay, so let's hop back into Simplify3D and into the process and into the scripts, and let's start thinking about what we want to put in here. So I'm just going to put some blank lines so it's easier to see what we're actually inserting here. Now I want to take control of the temperatures, because basically if the hot end gets up to temperature before my bed leveling exercise, I end up with little blobs of filament all over my print bed, which can lead to some issues if yeah, I then need to print later on in that same place. So I want to keep the hot end cold basically until after my bed leveling. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to insert some G-code to at least get the heated bed up to temperature. And for all the temperatures settings, there are two possible options. You can set the temperature and then carry on with the rest of the G-code, or you can set the temperature and basically stop any further execution of the G-code until that temperature has been reached and stabilized. So the first thing that we're going to put in is an M140, which sets the bed temperature but carries on with the rest of the G-code. And then to specify the temperature, we put in S. Now we could put in 50 here, but that would be a bit ridiculous because this would only work if our heated bed was always at 50 degrees. So the better way to do it is to insert some kind of placeholder or variable, whatever you want to call it. And these vary from slicer to slicer. I will include at least some of the main ones for Slic3r and Simplify3D in the website, which will be linked in the description below. But for now, I can tell you for Simplify3D, your first layer bed temperature is bed 1 and temperature in square brackets. And basically what that does is set the bed temp, and continue. And then what we'll do is we'll put another one in just to make sure, because we really want the bed up to full temperature before doing the bed leveling. So we'll put in M190, and then basically the rest is the same, except for the fact that this will then wait until it's got up to that temperature. Okay, so what we've done is we've told the printer to get the heated bed up to temperature and get it up to whatever we've set in wherever it is in temperature, probably here. So we only have one temperature for our bed for all layers, but in any case that's fine. It's 50 degrees or whatever it's set in here. This script will always set it to that temperature. Now all of the G codes, M codes and even T codes and any other codes that you can put in a G code file are all available on the RepRap wiki, and I will leave a link to that on the video notes, all linked below in the description. So anyway, now my heated bed is up to temperature. I'm going to do a homing, and that's G28, so that's pretty simple. And then in my case, because I do have bed level compensation, we're going to do a G29. So let's do bed level measurements. Oh, measurements. There we go, bed level measurements. Now what it actually does during this is dependent on how you set up your firmware. Basically G29 tells the firmware to do whatever bed level, compensation, or however you've got it configured in your firmware. So it's just a simple G29. So now that we've done that, basically we would have got our heated bed up to temperature, we've honed all the axis, and we've done our bed level measurements, and it also applies those to the print. So the next thing I want to do is I want to get the actual hot end up to temperature now, so that I can do some priming. And much like the bed temperatures, there are two commands. There's M104, which sets the hot end temperature and then continues with the G code. And what we want to do is we want to put in S for what the temperatures require, open square brackets, and then we'll put in extruder, and then the number of the extruder, which is 0 in my case, and then temperature, and close the square bracket. So this sets the hot end temp and continues. We'll then put in an M109, which is exactly the same thing, except it is setting the hot end temperature and waiting until it reaches that temperature. So let's just copy and paste that down here and wait, because we want obviously for the hot end to be up to our temperature before it continues with the rest of the G code. So that kind of would be it. If I didn't want to prime my nozzle, that would be about it. So let's have a look to see what effect this has. Obviously it's going to insert this G code, but now that we've got temperature settings in here and homing everything else, how much has it changed the G code that it had already inserted before and after, according to what we put in here? So let's take a look at that. Let's OK this, prepare the print, save it to there, do that, and we'll put in a new name for it. We'll call it 1, will do for now. And let's open that up. Scroll down until we find it, and here it is. Okay, so you can see that it has removed from its own settings any temperature settings, because it's looked into our starting G code and gone, oh, okay, you're setting the temperatures, I won't bother in that case. So it's removed them from there. It still has the G90, the M83, and setting the fan to nothing, which is all good, exactly what we want. If you wanted to do belt and braces, you could put G90 and M83 in your G code, and that really is going to be dependent upon each different slicer kind of handles things slightly differently. So that's why it's always important to see both before and after what the slicer is inserting in before your G code. So that's all happy situation. I'm now going to go back into Slicer, exit the preview, edit the process settings, go into scripts, and now I want to put in my actual priming. So I'm going to move the nozzle so it is completely off my bed. And to do that, I'm going to put in a G1, which is a type of move command, which you can look up in the RepRap wiki on all the G codes. And I'm going to move X to position 24, and I'm going to move it quite fast. So yeah, F is the speed. And basically that is moving the nozzle, or the axis, the X-axis, to 0.24 from G code 0, and 3000 is pretty fast. I'm then going to do the same but for the Y-axis, and I'm going to move the Y-axis to -37, which is why it's out of my print area, and I'm also going to move that at 3000. I'm then going to move my nozzle down quite close to the bed, so I'm going to put Z at 0.1 mil off the bed, and also do that pretty quick. Then what I'm going to do, because basically my nozzle is now hanging off of the side of the bed, is I can extrude a load of filament out. So I'm going to do the extruder, which is E, and I'm going to extrude 20 mil. Don't forget we are, for the extruder, with that M83 in place, which was still there. It's going to just move along 20 mil. It's just going to basically extrude out 20 mil of filament. And I'll do that reasonably fast for an extrusion, which F100 will take care of. And that should, well, it's going to extrude out 20 mil, so that should take pretty good care of getting it primed up. But just to make sure, I'm going to run a little line of filament along the bed, do a little wipe so that, yeah, we're ready to start printing. So in order to do all that, I'm going to move the nozzle now onto an area actually on the bed, but still kind of out of my normal printing area. So I'm going to do G1 Y minus 29 and move that pretty quick like so, and move the nozzle up to 0.2 mil will be fine. And we're going to move that really quick because it's just moving a tiny amount, and there, that's fine. Now the nozzle is actually on the bed somewhere, but out of my print area. I want to extrude a line, and to do that we will move the x-axis whilst also extruding some filament. So we'll do a G1 and we shall move x to 0.80 whilst also extruding some filament, and I'm going to extrude 9 mil of filament and do it all relatively quick. Now that should produce a fairly heavy line of filament, and that should be pretty good enough to make sure that we've got nice smooth lines coming. So directly after it does that, I still don't want it to start doing a print because we've just squeezed out a whole bunch of filament and it could drag some, you know, ooze over into the print area. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move the nozzle up to, let's say, 0.4 mil, also pretty quick. And then I will just quickly go back over that line that we just did to basically wipe the nozzle. So I'll do a G1 and X, and let's take it back to, let's say, 10. And we shall move that also pretty quick, like so. And yeah, we should then be ready to start our print. So it's going to go straight from there and whip off and start doing your first layer, raft, brim, whatever you've got going on. And that is essentially how I have my G-code currently. I probably need to be tweaking it a bit, but this is working for me at the moment. So if we OK that and do a prepare to print and save it out again, and let's this time save it as 2. Let's open that up. Let's scroll down to find our little G-code, ignoring the comments, and here we go. So we can see this is where our G-code starts. This is everything we've put in, and we can see that after the end of our G-code, Slicer is starting to do its own G-code, and what it's doing is it's doing a little bit of a retraction on the extruder, which is good. It is then lifting the Z-axis up, and then it is going over and starting the print, which in this case the first thing it's doing is a skirt. So it's positioning all the axis. It's positioning the Z-axis at our first layer height, 0.2 for this particular profile, and it is starting to do the print. And that's it. That is my starting G-code. Nothing amazing going on there. You may want to do things completely differently, and that is entirely up to you. It really depends on, like I said right back at the beginning, depends on what your machine needs, what you like, blah blah blah. I would just go and have a look at the RepRap wiki, which is pretty tricky to say, that I have linked on my website, where the details of which are all in the description below. And there we have it. If that seemed to end rather quickly, it is because I had actually planned to carry on and do the ending G-code part, but I realised that it's already got to a ridiculous length for really such a minor topic that I decided to say no, and we'll do the ending G-code in the next video, which hopefully should be short, because I won't go over the whole G-code bits and bobs and Slicer bits and bobs again. So what this all boils down to really is learning a little bit about G-code, which has G-codes and M-codes and some other things. And the best way to do that really is to examine the RepRap wiki website link that I've put on my video notes, which are linked and in the description below. And also to figure out exactly what it is you want to do and what it is your slicer is doing for you before the starting G-code and sort of after it a bit, and sort of intercepting that G-code from the slicer with the custom little bits and pieces you want. So yeah, wrap this up because it's too long. Next up, ending G-code.